Can you believe that at 69 years old you can still face survival challenges that would make 20-year-olds tremble with fear? Well, my name is João Silva, a Special Forces veteran with 3 decades of active service, and what you're about to witness in the next few minutes will completely shatter all preconceptions about age and survival ability in extreme environments. Have you ever experienced this? That feeling that everyone around you thinks you should take it easy because of your age? Well, that's exactly what I've been experiencing since I turned 65. Arthritis in my hands, controlled diabetes, and a legion of well-meaning people telling me to hang up my adventure boots and settle for quiet weekend fishing trips. But let me tell you something. Experience doesn't age, it improves. When we stepped onto that island at 8 in the morning, I expected a standard survival challenge. Find water, build shelter, make a fire, gather food. The basics any seasoned survivalist has mastered. What I didn't expect was that this seemingly uninhabited island held decades-old secrets. You know that feeling when something isn't quite right? Well, that's exactly what I felt in the first few minutes. Have you ever had the feeling that your pet knows something you don't? Multiply that feeling by 1,000, and you'll have an idea of what I was feeling. What you're about to discover may surprise you completely, because while I was focused on basic survival tasks, building a rudimentary shelter from branches and palm fronds, collecting rainwater using military techniques I'd learned decades ago, Rex couldn't focus on anything other than that particular patch of beach. With each passing hour, my companion's agitation grew. He clawed at the sand, moaned softly, and looked at me with those expressive eyes as if trying to communicate something urgent. And it was then that I made a decision that would completely change the course of this survival adventure. Allow me to properly introduce myself before continuing this story that completely changed my perspective on the limits of age and human capacity. My name is William Bill Harrison. I am 69 years old, a U.S. At 18, following in my family's footsteps, I enlisted in the Navy, where I spent the next 32 years of my life. During my military career, I served in 3 different armed conflicts and participated in countless rescue and survival operations in extreme environments. I was deployed for specialized training in maritime survival, jungle survival, and Arctic operations. For 15 years, I was an instructor at the Naval Survival School in Pensacola, where I trained hundreds of young sailors and pilots in the most advanced techniques for high-seas survival, emergency navigation, and rescue in hostile aquatic environments. I taught recruits how to build makeshift rafts, distill seawater using rudimentary equipment, and identify which fish and seaweed were safe to eat. When I retired from the Navy in 2008 at age 55, many people expected me to settle into a rocking chair on my porch, maybe do a little fishing on the weekends, and live comfortably off my military retirement benefits. But anyone who knows me knows I could never live a sedentary life. Adventure and challenge have always run through my veins like blood. It was then that I began working as a survival consultant for television programs, adventure tourism companies, and even for the U.S. I've spent weeks alone in the Colorado Rockies, weathered storms in the Louisiana swamps, and survived on deserted Caribbean islands using only a knife and my experience. Each expedition was an opportunity to test not only my technical skills, but also my physical and mental limits. But I confess that, at 65, I began to feel the weight of age. Arthritis began to appear in my hands, a result of decades of manipulating ropes, building shelters, and performing heavy labor in adverse conditions. Type 2 diabetes also arrived, a genetic inheritance that my active lifestyle had managed to delay, but not completely avoid. My hearing, affected by years of exposure to ship engines and military equipment, was no longer what it once was. It was around this time that many friends and family began suggesting I slow down. My daughter, Sarah, who lives in Tampa, would call me worriedly every time I left for an expedition. One of them, trying to be kind, suggested that perhaps I could help with the planning, or even tag along as an observer. That hit me like a punch in the gut. Observer? I, who had trained most of those men when they were raw recruits. I, who had developed half the techniques they intended to use on the expedition. It was at that moment that I made a decision that would change everything. I would prove, to myself and everyone else, that age is just a number when you have knowledge, experience, He had initially been trained as a military dog but was discharged from active duty due to a minor hearing problem that, ironically, had no effect on his detection and alerting abilities. When I learned he would be euthanized for not meeting military standards, I didn't hesitate to adopt him. Over the past 8 years, Rex has become much more than a pet. He was my training partner, my early warning system, and my best friend. I also revisited all the survival techniques I'd learned over the years, adapting them to my current physical condition. I discovered that while my raw strength had diminished, my efficiency had significantly increased. I knew exactly where to apply force, how to conserve energy, and which techniques produce the best results with the least physical exertion. The choice of island was strategic. Most importantly, Shell Island was completely isolated from commercial shipping routes, ensuring I wouldn't have any outside help during the 24-hour challenge. The island also had a history of being used occasionally by fishermen and sailors as a temporary stopover, but it had been officially uninhabited for decades. 3 weeks before the expedition, I conducted an aerial reconnaissance of the island using a small private plane piloted by a veteran friend. It was exactly the kind of environment I needed to prove my point. The week before the expedition, I finalized all my preparations. I organized my bare minimum equipment, a fixed-blade survival knife that had accompanied me for over 20 years, a military-grade flint for starting a fire, a small coil of parachute cord, and an empty water bottle that I would empty as soon as I reached the island. That was all. No food, no electronics, nothing that could be considered an unfair advantage. It was a Tuesday in March, with the forecast for stable but not necessarily favorable weather. Forecasters predicted highs of 28 degrees Celsius during the day, dropping to 16 degrees Celsius overnight, a range that would test my thermoregulation skills at 69 years old. There was also a chance of rain overnight, which could be either a blessing or a curse, depending on how prepared I was. At 6 in the morning, Rex and I boarded a small fishing boat I'd rented for transportation to Shell Island. When I established the rules for this survival challenge, I knew there could be no room for complacency or excuses. At 69, with all the physical limitations that age brings, I needed to prove, above all, to myself that experience and determination still mattered more than brute strength and youth. Therefore, the rules I created were intentionally rigorous, based on the most demanding standards of the military training I had taught for decades. For a 69-year-old man with controlled diabetes, however, this period became significantly more challenging. During my military career, I had supervised hundreds of 24-hour survival exercises, and I knew exactly what to expect. The first 4 hours are usually marked by adrenaline and energy, as the survivor focuses on establishing basic necessities: shelter, water, and terrain reconnaissance. It is during this period that mind control techniques and military discipline become crucial. The last 12 hours, including the dawn of the second day, are often the most difficult, when accumulated fatigue is compounded by dehydration and growing hunger. The second crucial rule concerned the permitted equipment. The knife I chose was a piece that had been with me for over 25 years. A carbon steel blade with a micarta handle that had been forged specifically for military use. During my career, this knife had helped me build hundreds of shelters, prepare food in adverse situations, and even defend myself when necessary. Its edge remained sharp after decades of use, and I knew every feature of that blade like I knew the lines of my own hand. Parachute cord, 15 meters of high-strength military cable, had been chosen for its versatility. During training, I taught soldiers how to use this type of cord to build fishing traps, tie down shelter structures, create simple pulley systems to move heavy objects, and even as first aid material in emergencies. 15 meters might seem short to a layman, but I knew how to maximize every inch. The empty water bottle served multiple purposes. Obviously, it would be my primary container for storing drinking water once I found or produced it, but it could also be used as a cooking vessel, a digging tool, or even as part of a solar distillation system if needed. The decision to empty it completely upon arrival on the island eliminated any unfair advantage and ensured that I would need to find fresh water using only my knowledge and skills. The third important rule stated that Rex, my German Shepherd, would be my only companion, but he also couldn't carry any equipment or supplies. He would be present only as a partner, using his natural instincts and training, but without any artificial advantages. This rule was important because I wanted the challenge to primarily test my own abilities, with Rex serving as a companion and warning system, not a survival tool. During my military career, I had participated in operations where communication was impossible for days or even weeks, so I knew how to handle isolation. But at 69, with family responsibilities and medical concerns, the idea of being completely disconnected for 24 hours created an additional psychological pressure that young soldiers rarely face. During decades of teaching survival techniques, I always emphasized to my students the importance of keeping the mind engaged and observant, even in situations of extreme physical stress. The specific choice of Shell Island as the challenge location also followed strict criteria. The island needed to be small enough for me to explore completely in a few hours, yet large enough to offer diverse natural resources and shelter options, and at least 3 spots where I suspected fresh water might be found. During my reconnaissance flight 3 weeks earlier, I had identified several interesting geological features on the island. There was a central elevation that rose about 30 meters above sea level, offering panoramic views and possible protection from strong winds. I also noted at least 2 areas where the vegetation was noticeably greener and denser, suggesting the presence of fresh water underground. To consider the challenge successful, I needed to survive the full 24 hours while maintaining my physical and mental health, build a functional shelter, secure access to clean water, and, if possible, obtain some source of food. Most importantly, I needed to do all of this without compromising my safety or health in a way that could cause long-term problems. I also established a secret emergency protocol. If Rex displayed extremely agitated behavior for more than an hour straight, it would be interpreted as a sign of imminent danger, and I would seriously consider aborting the mission. During our years together, Rex had developed the ability to detect severe weather changes and other environmental hazards long before I could perceive them, so his intuition would be my early warning system. The weather conditions forecast for the challenge period were typical of early spring in the Gulf of Mexico. Highs around 28 degrees Celsius during the day, dropping to around 16 degrees Celsius overnight, with a chance of light rain overnight and moderate southeast winds. These conditions were intentionally challenging without being dangerous, perfect for testing my survival skills without creating unnecessary risks. The 12-degree temperature variation between day and night would be particularly challenging for someone my age. At 69, the body loses efficiency in temperature regulation, and people with diabetes often have additional circulation problems that make it more difficult to maintain body heat at night. This meant that building adequate shelter and maintaining a fire would be absolutely critical to the success of the mission. Steady winds can be helpful for keeping insects away and keeping the fire going, but they can also make it difficult to maintain body temperature and can damage poorly constructed structures. My experience told me I should seek natural wind protection on the north side of the island, using the rock formations I'd observed during my reconnaissance. In the days leading up to the challenge, I mentally reviewed all the survival techniques I might need. For food, although I didn't expect to need much food in just 24 hours, I could identify at least 15 species of edible coastal plants common in the Gulf region. I knew improvised fishing techniques using natural materials, and I could potentially catch shellfish in the rocky areas of the island. Most importantly, I knew which plants and animals I should definitely avoid to avoid the risk of poisoning. To maintain the fire, I had memorized the combustion characteristics of at least 20 different types of wood and plant material found in the region, knew how to build fire structures that worked well, even in moderate winds, and mastered techniques for keeping embers alive overnight with minimal fuel. Mentally, I prepared myself for the psychological challenges I knew I would face. To combat these mental challenges, I planned to keep my mind occupied with constructive tasks, continually improving the shelter, gathering and preparing fire materials, systematically exploring the island, and closely observing the local wildlife. During my military career, I had learned that an idle mind is the lone survivor's greatest enemy. The night before the challenge, I slept only 4 hours, not out of anxiety, but intentionally. We also practiced one last time all the commands that could be useful during survival. Commands for silence, for finding water, for warning of danger, and for staying close without disturbing my work. When we finally boarded the small fishing boat on the morning of the expedition, I felt a familiar mix of anxiety and excitement I hadn't experienced since my active duty days. At 69, I was about to embark on the most significant challenge I had faced since my military retirement. Sitting in the bow of the boat with Rex beside me, I watched the island's silhouette gradually grow on the morning horizon, emerging from the crystal clear waters of the Gulf of Mexico like a green jewel surrounded by a ring of white sand. The sea breeze carried the familiar scent of salt and seaweed, mingled with something wilder and more primitive that only desert islands possess. At 7:50 a.m., Rex had accompanied me on dozens of smaller expeditions over the years, including several visits to other islands off the Florida coast, but I had never seen him display this kind of anticipatory agitation. I placed my hand on his neck to calm him, and I could feel the tension in his muscles, as if he were preparing for some kind of confrontation or challenge I couldn't yet perceive. I jumped from the boat into the shallow, knee-deep water and immediately felt the difference in temperature. The seawater was noticeably colder than I expected for the time of year, at least 5 degrees below the typical March temperature in the region. This could indicate unusual underwater currents or perhaps freshwater springs emerging from the seabed near the island, both potentially useful information for my survival. Rex leaped off the boat after me, but instead of running happily along the beach as he normally did, he remained close to my legs, occasionally glancing inland with an intensity that was beginning to worry me. Over our years together, I had learned to trust Rex's instincts as much as I trusted my own senses, and his behavior was clearly signaling to me that something about this island was different from the norm. The first step in any survival situation is always initial reconnaissance, a technique I had taught hundreds of soldiers over the years. I began walking slowly along the beach eastward, carefully observing every feature of the shoreline that might be relevant to my survival over the next 24 hours. The sand was composed primarily of finely ground shell fragments, mixed with small volcanic rocks that indicated ancient geological activity in the area. Using the appropriate command, I instructed him to search for sources of fresh water in the area. Normally, he would have immediately run to investigate the densest vegetation, where springs or rainwater collections were most likely. Instead, he looked me straight in the eye, took a few hesitant steps toward the island's interior, stopped, and returned to stand beside me. This behavior was completely out of character. The beach gradually gave way to a rockier area, where massive limestone boulders created a series of small coves sheltered from the wind. This area would be ideal for establishing a base camp, natural protection from the elements, proximity to water for emergencies, and multiple escape routes if necessary. In one of the larger coves, I discovered evidence of previous human visitation. The remains of an old campfire, some lengths of nylon rope frayed by time and sun exposure, and, curiously, several rusty cans that appeared to be at least 2 or 3 decades old. The cans were scattered in a manner that suggested a temporary camp, not just trash left by casual visitors. I examined the cans more closely and was able to identify some partially legible manufacturing marks. He had begun sniffing specifically in the direction of the island's interior, not casually as he normally would, but with the focused intensity I recognized from his military training to detect explosives or contraband. It was as if he had picked up a specific scent that triggered his training memories. Deciding I had gathered enough information about the coast to begin, I turned my attention to the island's interior. The trail headed toward the central elevation of the island I had observed from the air. Following this trail would be the most efficient way to explore inland, but it would also mean moving away from the relative safety of the coast. It was at this point that I made a decision that would completely change the course of my survival expedition. Instead of following my original plan of establishing a safe base camp on the coast first, I decided to immediately investigate Rex's strange behavior. During my military career, I had learned that ignoring the instincts of a well-trained animal was often a grave mistake. I used a specific command I had taught Rex during our years together, a command to follow a specific scent without distraction. Immediately, he assumed the working posture I recognized from his military training. Head down, deliberate and focused movements, pausing occasionally to confirm the direction of whatever he was sniffing. The area had been cleared by human hands, likely decades ago, and although nature had already begun to reclaim the space, the evidence of human activity was unmistakable. In the center of the clearing, partially covered by leaves and plant debris, stood a concrete structure that appeared to be the entrance to some kind of underground facility. The concrete structure was small, about 2 square meters, and had been built with techniques and materials that appeared military or governmental. On the other hand, Rex was displaying behavior that, throughout our years together, had always indicated the presence of something significant worthy of attention. My military experience told me that abandoned military installations on remote islands often contained emergency supplies, useful equipment, and sometimes even important information about the local area. This suggested that the underground structure was somehow collecting or filtering water, possibly through drainage or ventilation systems. If this structure was producing water as a byproduct of its construction, then investigating it would simply be using a natural water source that had been inadvertently created by previous human activity. This wouldn't technically violate my rules of survival, especially if I used only the water and not any other artificial resources I could find. I decided to investigate. The metal lid was heavy and partially corroded, but my decades of experience with military equipment allowed me to identify the opening mechanism. With considerable effort, I managed to turn the central wheel and lift the lid enough to reveal a metal staircase descending into darkness. The air rising from the interior was surprisingly cool and dry, indicating that the structure had some sort of ventilation system that was still functioning after decades. The underground structure was larger than I had expected, extending at least 10 meters in various directions from the base of the stairs. What I found down there would transform my 24-hour survival expedition into an experience that would challenge everything I thought I knew about Shell Island, about my own military history, and about secrets that had been buried for decades in the waters of the Gulf of Mexico. The only thing I knew for sure was that the sound of rushing water was getting louder the lower I went, and that Rex had led me to something that would fundamentally change the nature of my survival challenge on this seemingly deserted island. After briefly exploring the underground structure and confirming that there was a reliable source of fresh water flowing through a natural filtration system within the abandoned facility. Furthermore, my decades of experience in survival training had taught me that relying on artificial structures, even abandoned ones, can create a false sense of security that hinders the development of real survival skills. If I were to prove that a 69-year-old man could still face extreme challenges, I would need to do so primarily using natural resources and my own skills. However, discovering the freshwater source resolved one of my most significant concerns. Drinking water is always the first priority in any survival situation, and knowing I had access to a reliable source allowed me to focus my energy on other critical needs: shelter, fire, and potentially food. It was about 10 o'clock in the morning when I returned to the surface, and the March sun was already beginning to warm significantly. Rex had calmed down considerably since our exploration of the underground structure, as if his mission to alert me to the discovery had been accomplished. He was now behaving more normally, exploring the vegetation around the clearing and occasionally stopping to investigate sounds or scents that caught his attention. His more relaxed demeanor reassured me, suggesting there were no immediate dangers I needed to consider. The specific rock formation I chose consisted of 3 large limestone boulders meeting at a natural angle of approximately 120 degrees. This configuration created a sheltered space measuring approximately 3 meters by 2 meters, oriented so that the opening faced south, maximizing daytime sunlight, while offering protection from the cold, northerly nighttime winds. Building an effective shelter at age 69 presented unique challenges I hadn't faced when I was younger. Rather than attempting to build an elaborate structure that would require significant physical strength, I decided to focus on a design that maximized thermal efficiency and weather protection, using simple engineering principles and abundant local materials. The basic concept would be a support structure using larger branches wedged between rocks, covered with successive layers of plant material for insulation and waterproofing. The first step was to collect structural branches. During this collection phase, I had to take several breaks to rest my arthritic hands and reevaluate my work strategy. I found that alternating between tasks requiring fine manual dexterity and tasks requiring larger movements helped minimize pain and maintain my productivity. This was a valuable lesson in adapting to the physical limitations imposed by age. Rex proved a useful companion during the construction process, not because he could carry materials, but because his presence allowed me to work with more confidence, knowing he would alert me to any changes in the environment that I might not notice while focused on the construction tasks. He often stopped exploring to observe my work, and occasionally even brought back smaller branches he had found during his investigations. The basic support structure took approximately 2 hours to complete. To achieve this, I needed to collect large quantities of plant material, palm leaves for waterproofing, long grasses for insulation, and moss I found growing in the wetter areas near the water source. This phase of the work was physically more demanding, requiring multiple trips to transport enough material. During one of these collecting trips, I made an interesting discovery that demonstrated the value of careful observation during survival activities. While collecting moss near the underground structure, I noticed an area where vegetation had grown particularly lushly. Upon closer inspection, I discovered it was a small garden of edible plants that had naturalized from seeds likely left by the military installation's previous occupants. The presence of these plants also provided me with valuable information about the island's microclimate. The fact that typical domestic plants had survived and reproduced for decades in this environment indicated that Shell Island had more favorable soil and water conditions than its outward appearance suggested. This implied that the groundwater source likely fed a more extensive natural irrigation system than I had initially realized. Returning to building the shelter with armfuls of plant material, I began the careful process of creating layers of insulation and waterproofing. The technique I used was a variation of the method I had learned from indigenous communities during wilderness survival training decades ago, alternating layers of dense and loose material, creating air pockets that acted as natural thermal insulation. At 69, I found that my patience for detailed work had increased significantly compared to my younger years. Whereas before I might have tried to rush the process, I now understood the value of completing each step thoroughly before moving on to the next. Around 3 in the afternoon, with the sun reaching its peak intensity, I took an extended break to assess my progress and address my immediate physical needs. The water flowing through the natural filtration system within the abandoned facility was surprisingly clear and cold, obviously filtered through multiple layers of rock and sand along its underground journey. I tested the water using basic evaluation techniques I had learned during my military training: visual inspection for clarity and particulate matter, olfactory testing for odors that might indicate contamination, and a small initial sip to assess taste and immediate reactions. I also began to seriously consider the approaching night and the specific challenges I would face. The forecast predicted the temperature would drop to around 16 degrees Celsius overnight, a 12-degree drop that would be particularly challenging for someone my age. People with diabetes often have circulation problems that make it harder to maintain body heat, so I would need to ensure my shelter was effective and that I had a reliable fire throughout the night. I began by collecting a variety of fuel materials, sorting them by size and combustion rate. I needed fine, dry material to start the fire, medium-sized twigs to establish a consistent flame, and thicker wood to sustain the fire for extended periods. Shell Island offered an abundance of all these materials, but finding adequately dry material required careful exploration. Eventually, I found several trees that had fallen naturally during previous storms, offering hard, dense wood that would burn slowly over several hours. The process of collecting and transporting this heavier wood was physically challenging, requiring me to make multiple trips and develop techniques for moving heavy loads without straining my arthritic joints. During one of these fuel collection expeditions, Rex led me to another interesting discovery. In an area of the island I hadn't explored before, we found evidence of an ancient shipwreck, fragments of naval timber, corroded metal parts, and, curiously, several objects that appeared to be of much older military origin than the underground installation we had previously discovered.
Está pronto. Porque essa jornada, diferente de tudo mídia ensina,